Okay, this is the third of the religion module stuff. I just sent you guys an announcement that has some, potential readings that you might find of interest, things to look at during the Christmas break, if you find some of these topics interesting. I intentionally pick stuff in a bunch of different areas. There's tons of literature on myth and religion. Well, religions, mythology, folklore, et cetera, especially in American anthropology. Because you have to remember, European anthropology tended to look at colonial areas. So if you're a British anthropologist, you didn't study in England. If you're a British anthropologist, you studied in Indian parts somewhere in India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, some other part of the British Empire. And again, this idea of translation. The function of anthropology, till basically the 1950s in many ways, was the translation of colonial populations for their overlords, or the guys that were managing the place. In the American tradition, it was a little bit different. The colonial possessions in the United States were reservations. So unlike the European thing where you kept them separate, in the United States, as the Anglo-European population moved across the continent, they basically, encapsulated the Native Americans. You either genocide them or you put them on reservations. By the time that anthropology starts up in the late 19th century, in North America, Indian populations were seen as disappearing. So what you have is sort of a realization, we still see this in Thanksgiving with the idea of Indians, that the Indian populations were relevant to the history of North America, but they weren't really a part of it anymore. And so there was a concern that you're going to try to get hold of what was left of these, quote, disappearing populations before everything about them completely vanishes. Same was true in the early 20th century here in Hawaii, as Hawaiian traditional culture pretty much vanishes in many ways, at least from sight. What you get is a lot of concern by intellectuals to basically recover that material and record it from the people that still remember it before it's pretty much gone. Having said that, what's really sort of depressing in the 21st century is I don't see the same agendas occurring, for example, in Micronesia or in the other areas of Polynesia, with the exception of Tahiti. The French have actually been pretty good. There's a number of French anthropologists, sociologists, etc., trying to basically recover everything possible about the oral and social traditions, especially oral traditions related to religion, myth, and stuff in the society group and other areas of French Polynesia. I don't see the same thing occurring in the independent states of Samoa or, for example, Tonga, and certainly not in any of the Micronesian regions. That's largely, if it's not gone, it's on the cusp of disappearing. And there seems very little interest in the various governments in the region to actually grab that a very important part of their heritage before it's gone. So we're actually sort of fortunate here in Hawaii because back in the 19th century, this was of interest, of course, with a huge number of Hawaiian newspapers, which were just starting to get back through, which recorded a lot of that stuff. In the late 19th century, the Thrums annuals, which I use in the other classes, we're talking about, a lot of those articles were dealing with traditional Hawaiian beliefs and myth. In the 20th century, as on that shopping list, one of them was Beckwith's Hawaiian mythology, which is still sort of the key source for all that. But again, that was based on a lot of earlier material. So here in Hawaii, because one, the population was very literate very quickly, and two, one of the main agendas of that literacy was discussions in various ways, shapes, or forms about what is Hawaiian tradition, even in the 1830s, for example. We have a tremendous amount of available literature. It's just a matter of wading through it. Sad to say that's not true in the rest of the Pacific. Almost nowhere else in the Pacific was literacy embraced the same way. And for whatever set of reasons, I've never seen a discussion about this. There doesn't appear to be anywhere else in the Pacific where discussions about tradition were carried out in a coherent way. Now, you get a lot of places in the rest of Polynesia, for example, Samoa and Tonga, where tradition is incredibly relevant to how people deal with stuff. And they always bring up the word tradition. But that tradition is within the memory and interpretation of the living. It's not held in some sort of a repository where you can actually look at what someone wrote, for example, 1860. It's what someone in 2020 thinks about what happened in 1860, which, if you know anything about memory, is always a slippery proposition. So we don't see that. And, if any of you are Pacific Islanders, especially Micronesian, and you want to do something useful, I would strongly suggest that becoming central in the collection of oral material from relatives, friends, and other old folks to build up a corpus of material on myth and folklore and religion. is sadly lacking, and you know, it's going to be gone within another 20 years because the population that remembers that stuff is rapidly disappearing. In some places are gone already. So anyways, so that sort of thing, that reading list is to see, and I show you what some of that stuff is in other societies. And some of it, like yokai, for example, yokai and oni are so central in anime and manga and all sorts of, you know, popularized stuff, that it's actually sort of interesting if you look at what's that? Yeah, Foster's work, which is actually not the most entertaining reading, but if you're familiar with yokai, that whole sort of view of the mythos and folklore of Japan, it's a really fascinating look into the sort of the logic of how that's changed over time, which would be applicable to a lot of places, I think. Griffiths is probably one of the most interesting works because he's actually looking at the existing relationship that people have with belief and place in Sonora province, which I'm slightly familiar with from way back in the day. And it's an interesting amalgam of traditional belief systems and Christianity / Catholicism that came in about 400 years ago, and how they've also mixed and changed and turned into something that's very, very unique to that region, which is something you see if you ever go to Mexico, is the tremendous diversity in what's, you know, apparently sort of the Christian Catholic ethos as you move from one region to another in terms of how people interpret and use it. What you see in Sonora is hugely different than what you see, say, in Yucatan or some other area that's under, yes, the Yucatec Mayan region. Yet they're all technically Catholic. So it's really sort of fascinating, the variations you see. Anyways. Okay, to get in what I really want to sort of cover today. And that is this whole issue of revitalization-millenarian. Again, if you think of religion as being sort of this package of belief systems, it's typical. And the fact that anthropology, much of anthropology, even say into the post-World War II period, was really looking at colonial issues, you know, areas under colonial management. In the early 20th century, what you find is the British are in control of much of the Pacific, especially in Melanesia. They don't actually want to deal with that stuff. So what they do is they farm it off to their very, you know, sort of Anglo colonies, i.e. the Australians, New Zealanders, or more accurately the Pakeha and the Aussies. And they're not interested in them studying their own areas. What they're interested in is Australian, New Zealand anthropologists looking at other areas under British control in Melanesia. And initially it's just to figure out how these people tick so that British can figure out how to manage them more efficiently. But what very quickly becomes very clear by the early 20th century, and especially it's coming back from missionaries who are complaining about this. So the British are hearing this in letters from missionary groups in England, you know, complaining about and colonial management. And also just because they're hearing it from Australian New Zealanders who are trying to work in this area. And what they hear is this pop-up of all these new religions, just popping up literally like popcorn all over the place in parts of Melanesia. And the British aren't sure what's going on. They're not really managing this area. They basically tell the Australians, here, manage this part of the Pacific for us. So they sort of, they outsource it basically to Aussies. So they tell the Aussies, okay, we're hearing complaints, go sort this mess out. So the Australians send government representatives into Melanesia, and pretty soon they're writing back all these, you know, really sort of fun to read actually when you read some of these old letters in the 20s and 30s about, yeah, you know, there's all religions starting up, and there's da-da-da-da, and this place is doing da-da-da, and, you know, and they all seem to have some common factors. And the Australians couldn't figure out what to call these, you know, when they were seeing these things going on. So they decided they were religious, because obviously they were religious. They were belief systems. They were oftentimes not necessarily totally anti-Australian, but they were definitely pretty anti-colonial. And so the Australians start to press a panic button because they're thinking, oh no, these are actually, you know, these are like Bolshevism was seen in the early 20th century. You know, it was an anti-Western, anti-this, anti-that's all packaged into one thing. So this becomes, in fact, there were a couple of these guys that actually thought it was somehow Russian Bolsheviks were somehow in Melanesia. God knows where the hell they got that. And so what you get is worries that this is a politically destabilizing situation and could lead to, in the modern context, terrorism. So they send more guys in to study, and they can't get heads or tails to this whole thing. So in desperation, they send in some anthropologists and say, here, try to figure out what this religion is so you can explain it to us so we can figure out what we're going to do with it politically. So the anthropologists go in and take a look at this stuff. Now, World War II intervenes, and they don't get an answer yet. But they start to see that there's a lot of these different religions. In this context, they quickly come to the conclusion that, initially, which is totally wrong, that all these religions are actually based in one thing. And what they actually do is they see these as being like Islam in Northern Africa, which the British weren't really familiar with in the 19th century, the rise of the Mahdi in the Sudan. The British see this as being very much the same type of situation with what they see a messiah, a messianic figure starting in Melanesia who's trying to unify Melanesia and kind of throw the Australian British out. So, everyone starts to press the panic button. There's people running around. They start arresting Melanesians because they think they're actually, like leaders in this new religious anti-Australian movement. And much to the confusion, it doesn't seem to have any effect on anything. Whatever was going on just keeps on going on as if they hadn't done anything at all. World War II gets in the middle of it. World War II ends. The Australians go back in this area, find the stuff still going on, and start to study it in more detail. And then you get some guys from ANU, Australian National University, who go into the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, and actually start looking at this in detail versus like bouncing around and collecting little tidbits, little TikTok episodes, you might say. These guys start looking in detail. And what they realize is that, one, there is no leader. The majority of these get called John Frum cults. And it isn't until the anthropologists go in that they realize where this comes from. You guys see the same thing if you look like a Bank of Hawaii ad or something like that. They're trying to get you to get a debit card. They'll actually show you a card with a fake name at the top and, use this card and do da-da-da-da-da. Well, in the 20th century, when they were trying to get people to understand in Melanesia how to use the postal system, how to send a package or a letter, they would show you, an image of the front of a postcard or a letter, and they'd say, okay, here's how you address it. And they would use John Smith or something like that, and then an address below it. And if you want to get something, you got to tell people and to put John, one address below it. So we're using these as examples. In Melanesia, since people were very unfamiliar, one, with English, had no idea what the hell the Australians were talking about in terms of the postal service, they very quickly came to the idea that to get stuff, it made sense to have somehow the word John was attached to the messaging. So rather than seeing it as an example, they actually thought it was part of the process by which you do it. So when they were talking about John Frum cults, it was actually John Frum, or from John. They flipped it. And that became the name what they were calling the cults, which the Australians picked up on and decided those were the religion. It was the John Frum religion. So these guys from ANU go in and they go like, no, man, this is actually a reflection of what you were trying to teach them. They've named these belief systems, these new religions, after the Australian attitude that when you send stuff by packages, it's got to have an address. Now, if you want to think about it, you have to remember in this period, getting a box or something from somewhere else was pretty much like shopping on Amazon now. The only way you could get anything was through, the 19th, 20th century version of mail order, which was like the early version of what's now, online shopping. So the only time something different would show up in a village in Melanesia would be when a package arrived. So the stuff, since there wasn't any production in Melanesia, the only time Melanesians saw anything was European, whether it be books or a lantern or radio or whatever, was when boxes with stuff in them came from somewhere else. And there wasn't any idea of factories or production. There's just poof, and like from magic, all of a sudden this box would show up and there'd be goodies in it. So not surprisingly, they tied this all into the fact that in this new religion, if you did rituals, you could make boxes of stuff show up. And this is why they were called the John Frum cults, because these people came up with the belief system which said that if you do the right type of rituals, then boxes of the stuff that you want will show up, and they're sent by John Frum. And so, it's long since gone to sort of like the mythos anthropology stories of Melanesia, this whole sort of process. Now, what's key about it is not so much that, unless you're a Melanesian specialist, like part of my background is. But for you guys, what's really key is that when the ANU guys were done looking at this, they realized that even though there were a bunch of totally different religions, these people weren't talking to each other, they didn't have any sort of shared context. They were just making this up on their own. But they were all having to deal with the Australians and then the Japanese and all the other stuff in World War II. So they were dealing with the same stress factors. And what the ANU guys realized is the same stress factors were resulting in many of the same type of ways to deal with stress, especially ritual stress, because among other things, in Melanesia, as in much of the world, the religions that people had in their traditional religious system didn't really address the type of world that showed up when the British and the Australians and the rest of the colonial world suddenly showed up. Their traditional religions couldn't explain the Australians, and they couldn't explain colonialism. And so, if you remember, I mentioned this before, religion is on one hand incredibly durable because it's belief-based. It's not based in testing or data or things. On the other hand, that also makes religion out of something like glass, because if there's any question in that belief system, the whole thing shatters. And that's what happened in much of Melanesia. The belief system couldn't handle the changes that were occurring in Melanesia. So people started to not believe, or they started to question their belief system. And that's what the ANU guys realized. They realized that what they had here was a question of faith. People were questioning the world they'd been brought up with in terms of belief and ritual. And they started looking for something new. And they realized that what was really key about this, and this is because of the huge diversity of groups and cultures in Melanesia, is this actually a heaven-sent opportunity for anthropologists, because you could actually look at entirely different regions, totally different language, totally different belief systems, but they were really close to each other. And in their studies of them, they realized that there were a set of common factors which applied to all of them equally. And when they came back and wrote this up, this became the sort of template that we now use when we're talking about millenarian or revitalization movements. Now, one of the things we think, we don't have, again, proof, but I'm not sure anthropology is really big on proof, is that, and again, going back to Durkheim's thing, if the function of religion is to explain the unknowable, then the function of religion is to explain all the unknowable. Now, in some cases, like if you're a Theravada Buddhist, it just basically says, the world operates this way, the universe operates this way, and then just deal with it, which is why Theravada Buddhism isn't all that super popular as a form of Buddhism, because it really doesn't provide you with detailed answers on much of anything. Mahayana Buddhism, on the other hand, provides you really nice detailed answers, which is the monkey book, is Mahayana Buddhism. So what you find is most religions, to be effective, have to be able to explain the parts of the world that people live in to their satisfaction, so they have comfort that there's a reason to get up in the morning again. What these guys pointed out is if you follow Durkheim's logic, then it makes sense that the religions in Melanesia would start to sort of fold, because they couldn't explain the world that suddenly showed up in the 19th, 20th century in the front of Melanesians. And what they realized is that sequence then it appeared that would apply to anyone. If you put any group in a situation where all of a sudden the traditional religion doesn't seem to work anymore in terms of providing those beliefs that Durkheim said were central to the function of belief, then people aren't going to suddenly just get rid of religion. They're going to try to find a new set of beliefs that will do that. In other words, if they'll shop around and try to find a better package of things. And this was the real key thing the ANU guys brought back, is the idea that revitalization-millenarian movements were actually apparently universals. If you put any society in a situation of this type of stress, where the belief system doesn't seem to fit well anymore, then you're going to find these things take place. And the reason they knew that is they went back to Australia post-World War II, the 1950s, and what they find? They found us general, city, Anglo-Australians were having the same type of issues and belief, et cetera, that they saw in Melanesia, and they were going through the process in exactly the same sequence. So we think this is as close as you can get to a universal, given Durkheim's premise that people have to have a sense of reason, that they're not going to suddenly just drop it. They're going to search around, and that process of losing and searching is what we call revitalization-millenarian movements. So if you look at the panel here, these are the stages. Now, these stages originally were constructed by that work in Melanesia, but they apply, as far as we can tell, pretty much and certainly apply to American society in 2020. And so the key is first, and remember these are sequential, so it's 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. It's not, you can't hop and skip. The first is you have this loss of what you might call faith, but it's actually a loss in the veracity of the belief system. In other words, people start to not be able to relate the world that they thought existed out there on the other side of the screen. It doesn't explain the world that they find themselves living in. So at that point, they start to question the traditional religion. Why doesn't it explain this? Why doesn't it explain Australians to the folks in Papua New Guinea, for example? And if it doesn't, then you start to question that. Now, if you want to think about this, then think of this in this context. Think of going on like a roller coaster. You go on the roller coaster, you're bolted down in it, and you're along for the ride. You're not in a position of control. You don't stop and start the roller coaster. You're in it. If you don't like it, you just scream and throw up or whatever, but you're there till it stops, it ends. In that type of situation, there's a strong sense that you're not in control. In Durkheim's, one of Durkheim's terms that he used is if you put a population in a situation where people no longer feel like they're in control of the situation and also feel like the situation doesn't really relate to them, then he called that perception or that state of being to be anomie. Now, anomie is one of those words in French that has real different words, and it just doesn't translate. There's no English comparison to it. It's not anonymous. There just isn't an English word for it. But I'll give you an example though. That would be that you say you've been at Chaminade for, well, no, even better. You've been in high school. You're a senior in high school. You've been at the same school. You've grown up with all these people, and you go to a party, one weekend. And it's the same people, same party. You've done this a ton of times, and you know exactly what you're going to expect. You get to the party, and all of a sudden, for some reason, you start to look around, and you just sort of feel like you're not really there. You look around at people talking about stuff that was interesting the day before, and all of a sudden, it doesn't really seem that interesting to you. You wonder why they're worried about that, why they're spending their time on that. Why aren't they talking about something else? You're not sure what something else should be, but it's not there. Now, there's nothing different about the situation. You're the one that's changed. Your perception of that situation, that group of people, and what they're about has suddenly pulled out from that, from what was your norm. So the key to anomie is not change within the group. It's the fact that all of a sudden the people in the group do not feel like they're actually part of the process anymore. They become dislocated from the world they live in. And the key thing, that's the key thing to remember about anomie. It's not if I suddenly take one of you and throw you into Chinese society and you're living in the city of Xi'an. Okay, that's acculturation, assimilation. You're having to deal with a different culture. It'd be if you suddenly get up one morning in the world that you're used to, in the world that you were brought up in, and all of a sudden you look around you and it's sort of like, why are people worried about this? What's the meaning of this? I don't understand. This just seems like this is silly. In other words, nothing's changed in that situation but you, or more accurately, your perception of it. That's anomie. Now, when individuals go through that, that's for various forms of psychological stress, etc. When groups go through that, that's the trigger for a revitalization-millenarian movement. And there's just two different words for the same thing. Revitalization is the one we usually use in anthropology. So anomie is when you see group questioning of the system, which is, again, can be seen as, for example, this loss in the traditional faith system, faith in the traditional system. If that happens, as Durkheim pointed out, people aren't going to just go like, oh no, and run around in a panic and just, become agnostic. They're going to look for a new way of answers. They're going to look for a new package. And you have to remember, for someone that's even for some agnostics, but certainly for atheists, atheists are very frequent when you talk to them, actually have a belief system. It's just not based in the concept necessarily of a divine, but they definitely have a structured belief system. So, they're still fit in this idea of tradition. So if you end up with a group who ends up lost, what they're going to do is they're going to look for new answers. Now, the interesting thing is, this is what they and you guys didn't realize, and this is actually the part that's really critical here, is they're not going to invent a new religion. They're not going to sit down one afternoon and everyone gets together collectively and says, hey, why don't we do this? Yeah, why don't we do that? Why don't we do, they're going to come build this brand new, thesis and a whole, new text of religion, etc. What they're going to look is for something that takes as little time and effort as possible. And they're also going to look for a role model who displays this new set of viewpoints. So the key thing with revitalization movements is two things. One is it's going to be very, very simplistic. New religions are invariably very, very short. They would fit on one or two, PowerPoint slides. They're going to be very, very straightforward. They're going to be very easy to remember. They're not going to be complicated. There's going to be no complex theology involved in them. The bulgars are simple. And the reason that is people are coming from loss. And what they want is something, they want a life preserver of beliefs. And so they want something that's going to be simple and straightforward, that doesn't take a lot of time, that they can grab onto and get back to a comfort zone. Now, what they're also going to want is somebody, some person that's basically going to act as the role model, spokesperson, explainer of this new set of bullet points, of this new set of slides. And so they're going to want a prophet, they're going to want a Messiah. Okay. So it needs those two parts. One is it needs to be very simple, very straightforward, not complicated. Two, you need to have someone who actually is going to be the spokesperson, role model, etc., for this new set of beliefs. If people see this, this allows them something to jump onto that takes very little effort on their part, but it gives them a huge amount of comfort because now there's a new set of beliefs that are replacing the old ones that sort of went, you know, for whatever set of reasons. An interesting part of this is because people largely are still in their old world. You have to remember their attitudes and values and stuff are still part of what was the old belief ritual system. So they're not changing that much. They just want a new set of explanations which give them more comforting answers in the changing world around them. What you're going to find is invariably in this new set of beliefs, this new, you know, two slide bullet points with a new prophetic messianic leader. What they're also going to want is this is going to have to refer back to their past. So when you look at revitalization movements, one of the really fascinating things about them is they invariably talk about sometime in the past, usually not really very well defined, when this particular group was really important, powerful, and was in success, and most importantly, in charge of their world. So these things don't refer to the future. These things invariably refer to the past, but it's not a past that's accurate. It's a fictitious past. So it's sort of a Disney Pixar past, once upon a time. And that becomes a huge part of this. So basically the message looks like this. You get someone that people really find compelling for whatever set of reasons. They find them compelling in terms of the way they present themselves and what they're talking about. What they're supposed to know in this new religion is maybe like 5 or 10 points. All these 5 or 10 points are going to be based, are going to be justified in the back in the day when we were somebody important, these are the things that we really held that made us different and made us successful were these 10 points. We have lost those since then, and that's why you guys feel so bummed. And so if you follow me, I'll take you back to this. Just remember, you got to do these 10 points and we'll be like our ancestors. So you go back to a past that is based on the world that maybe you sort of wanted, but it's not based in, you know, some sort of historical documented accuracy. It's in a fictitious past. And you see this with revitalization movements everywhere. One of the most famous would be if you ever look at the studies of the ghost dance done in the Plains area, where basically in the 1880s, 1890s, Native American populations who had been completely, you know, thrown off of their lands, put on reservations, etc., find this new prophet and this new very simplistic religion. And if you follow this religion, we'll go back to when we were powerful. Among other things, the ghost dance promised that if everyone believed in it, all the Anglos that were coming, you know, in North America would suddenly be shot back to Europe. You wouldn't have to kill them. The buggers just one day they'd be gone, and all the buffalo would come back, and the world would be back to the way it used to be before the white man came and screwed it all up. And so it's a classic example of this fictitious past. Was that past ever that benign? No. Native Americans are really good at killing each other. In fact, a lot of the groups, including mine, are really good at killing their own members. They didn't have to go outside of the group. I mean, find the same thing with you know, millenarian belief systems in the early 20th century in Hawaii. You know, Hawaiian groups that were part of these new revitalization movements would very frequently talk about, you know, if you follow this stuff, then all the howlies here are going to disappear, and to go back to a real happy, benign, pleasant, friendly place where everyone gets along, food falls out of trees, and it's just basically paradise. Was it that way? No, but that's the way it's portrayed in these revitalization movements, because you're trying to get people to follow these rules, and you have to logic these rules in the collected, fictitious, sort of idealized past that people share. So you don't talk about something new. You talk about going back to the old ways. And if you think about contemporary American society, you see this a lot. When people talk about how you've got to change, how the United States has to go back to the ways it used to be what it used to be. What you're talking about are revitalization movements. People aren't happy with where it is. Their belief system doesn't explain it very well, and they feel anomie. They feel lost collectively, and in doing so, they're going to try to find a new set of answers. Now, one of the ways that you're going to have to do that, then, if you're going to go back to a fictitious past, of course, you're not using the word fictitious, is that you're going to have to change the present in terms of social and political structure, so that you can go back to that point in the past. If you're Native American, you can't go back to hunting the buffalo and having the open plains until you get rid of the howlies, until you get rid of the Anglos. So that's social political change to make that happen. In the case of Hawaiian movements in the early 20th century, you have to get rid of the idea of land control, and you have to bring back not the monarchy, but you have to bring back chiefs and stuff like that. And you have to get rid of all the outsiders and the plantations. So therefore, that's social political change. So almost invariably, revitalization movements have a social political agenda to them because they can't achieve their whatever set of beliefs and the past unless you make those changes in the present. Now, of course, what that also means that then puts you in control of the present, which of course was the original reason for this stress in the first place. Now, what's really interesting about revitalization movements is very rarely do they actually succeed, because you have to have a pretty much, if not complete, a huge portion of the population actually agree to the new leader, to the new set of beliefs, to how you're going to achieve it, to what that past actually was. All those have to fall in place for a huge part of the population for it to actually then happen. One of the few cases I know where it actually happened would be Iraq in the I don't remember if it was the 70s or 80s, when they overthrew the Shah and they went back to being their version of an Islamic state. There was basically enormous consensus with the vast majority of the population on not only what they didn't like, but also what they wanted to be. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini, I think that's who it was the Messiah figure that they take hold of, and this set of very uncomplicated pronouncements became their version of Islam. And in doing so, they then made the social political changes to make this all happen. Very rare situation of a revitalization, but that movement that actually finishes. Most of the time what happens is it spins out between 2, 3, and 4. That's what you certainly see in the United States or in most of Europe right now, in most places, would be this idea that there's no agreement, for example, on who the Messiah is going to be. There might not be a lot of agreement on what the points are. There might not be much agreement on even what the fictitious past was. What past do you want? Do you all agree on it? And then, of course, there's not going to be a lot of necessarily agreement on the social political change that you have to make this happen. So you need to have an enormous consensus within a group for revitalization to complete. Otherwise, it's like watching a gerbil on a wheel. You know, the thing just keeps on going around. New messiahs pop up, new beliefs pop up, the old ones disappear, and you know, and there's not enough agreement for them to ever actually sort of fix. What's really interesting is even when you do see ones that succeed, is of course there's a really weird set of internal contradictions. Because if you're promising a group of people that if they do these 10 things, they're going to go back to a past, but that past is a not real past. That past is a fictitious past. It's a Disney Pixar past. Then, you know, that's never going to happen. I mean, literally, you know, you could have something where basically, you know, Hawaii becomes a revitalized state and you throw out everyone who isn't Hawaiian. Okay, fine. That leaves you with about, you know, what, 60, 80,000 people here. But the land's totally changed. How much of the population really wants to live under a system of chiefs? Who's going to be the commoners? Who's going to be the kalava, the slaves? You know, who gets to pick? Who gets to choose? All of a sudden, the realities of a fictitious past, all of a sudden you have to make them happen, and they have to be in a way that people can accept them. And so there's inherent contradictions in trying to talk about a past that never existed, at least not the way you're spinning it. Then you see this in the mainland United States. Oh, we want to go back to mom and apple pie. You know, little communities where people trusted each other and da-da-da-da-da. Ain't nothing wrong with that, but how are you going to do that? You know, in the modern world we live in, especially with things like social media, how are you going to live in a past of villages and small towns? You know, you can't. There's inherent contradictions in what you're promising and what you could possibly deliver. So on one hand, the revitalization movements are really interesting because what they're promising, they know they can't deliver in some way, shape, or form. It ain't happening. On the other hand, if you go back to what Durkheim was talking about, what people really need is a set of beliefs that they think works to explain the world around them. So a revitalization movement, again, Iraq's a good example, did not deliver because one of the things they were promising is if Iraq went back to this new system, this new messianic revitalization movement, it would again become Persia. And it would again basically rule the whole Middle East because that's what they used to be in their fictitious view of themselves way back in the day. Well, it didn't happen because the world in the 1980s wasn't the world of 800 or 900 AD. It was a hugely different world, a much more complicated, much more global world. So you couldn't go back to that world because the rest of the world wasn't willing to let you have that. Having said that, what it did apply for most Iraqis at the time, or I should say, I'm sorry, Iranians, this is Iranian, I shouldn't use it, was that did give them a set of answers that resolve the anomie issue. So what you got was a new belief system which people felt comfortable with and really did feel it gave them answers to stuff, which according to Durkheim is what they really needed. They don't need to go back to a fictitious past. You don't need to make necessarily the changes. What you need is a sense that the religious belief system you have explains adequately the world around you that you experience. And so the fascinating thing about revitalization movements is they're inherently incapable of succeeding in the sense that they can't give everything they promise. But that doesn't mean that they don't do what they've really got to do, which is basically resolve anomie among the group that's stressed out. So for example, Vanuatu and in Melanesia is a good example of, again, of a revitalization movement that worked under Dr. Walter Linney, who was basically the Messiah prophet. The population, that part of Melanesia actually joined together and actually came up with a new system. And in that system, which integrated into the past, they actually now have a fairly comfortable idea of where they fit in the world, and their belief system's fairly stable, compared ironically to the groups around them where that didn't happen in the rest of Melanesia. And they resolved some of those contradictions. And so what you have is one of those rare examples of a revitalization movement that basically, I suppose, maybe finished. I'm not sure what word you want to use. Fascinating part of anthropology, hugely relevant, because I would almost guarantee no matter what group you are or where you are, you're probably in a revitalization movement. It's pretty much a global phenomena. And I would say especially with social media, which tends to exacerbate this idea of instability and provides even more need for explanations. So, when you look at all this, this is, I would argue, for example, in the context of revitalization, the current discussion right now, post-elections, is a classic example to anthropologists. It's like there's absolutely no surprise in the way the discussions are going on now in terms of what actually happened in the elections, what's going to happen after the elections. That's very typical of this, stage one phenomena that the Australians saw first in the 1950s and realized as a phenomenon in the 1950s. It's very easy to understand American society if you realize it's in the process of struggling through, phase 2 and 3 of a revitalization movement. But it's also, given the complexity of American society, it's no surprise that it's not resolving any of that. Okay. So that's sort of the last part of all of this. Oh, with the exception of landscape. It's important to remember that with many societies, in fact, the majority of societies, landscape or place is a key part of belief in religious systems, because places are tied to particular beliefs or events that occurred mythologically or in folklore or whatever. And so therefore, places actually have an integral part of religion or belief systems. American Christianity is one of the few that, with few exceptions, really doesn't do that. That's because the Christianity and the people were imported. If you look at Christianity in Europe, places are really important. Christianity in North America, not very much, and in many cases, not at all. There's no particular reason why the chapel's where it is here on campus. It's just there because it's there. There's no reason, as far as I know, why the church is down there and St. Patrick's is down there where it is. It's just there. Having said that, the traditional Hawaiian belief system, there used to be a heiau down where the rifle range is down here on campus. That was there very specifically because of that place. That place basically spoke to the people that built religious sites and said, this is where you should put one. So the traditional Hawaiian system, sites had mana, and that would be why you put something there. And you find this very much in a huge majority of other religions. That's why two of those readings I've got, especially the Celtic one, is a really good example of how, and the Greek ones also, traditional Greek and Roman, especially Greek, ritual sites were always based on mana. Of an actual landscape. And then so the features or the structure, the things that you build are actually integrated places first, and the ritual religious site or whatever is second. So it's important to remember that American society is very odd in that regard. There's no relationship between place and religion, at least in a sort of mainstream Christianity. That's really, really rare, even in Christianity. So anyways. Okay, so with that, I think that's probably enough to keep you guys entertained. Do take a look at that announcement thing. It just has a sort of bibliographic list of easy readings. All of them are quite interesting. All of them are really good. The only one that's a little hard to get through is probably Foster's one on yokai, just because that's a little more dense. But on the other hand, if you're interested in that as subject, then it's a superb work. The rest of them are real painless to go through, and I think you'll find them entertaining.